I'm Noel Radomski, the Managing Director at Wiscape, and I'd like to introduce Pat Brady, the author of A History of the University of Wisconsin System. Pat Brady retired in the fall of 2010 after a 30-year career with the University of Wisconsin System, where she served as Senior System Legal Counsel, Deputy General Counsel, and General Counsel from 2002 to 2010. Before joining the UW system, Pat was an assistant attorney general in North Carolina, where she was represented where she represented the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and the University of North Carolina. Pat has also been a frequent speaker on legal issues in higher education, and she has taught higher ed law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Pat received her BA from UW-Madison and her law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School. I'm going to stop there because she has a lot more on her bio, but it gives you a flavor of Pat Brady's experience. Pat Brady's new book, A History of the University of Wisconsin System, just published by the UW Press, has been called the definitive account of one of the nation's largest public higher education systems. It is, quote, the essential, unvarnished story of the unique collection of institutions that serve Wisconsin and the world, and a convincing argument for why recognizing and reinvesting in the system is critically important for the economic, civic future of the state and its citizens. Please note we'll be sharing information on how to order this book at a discount before you leave today. If you need to leave early, we will also be sharing this information in a follow-up email after the event. We'll start today's discussion with some prepared questions, which I will ask, and then we'll take questions from the audience at the end. You can use the Q&A tool on the lower right of your screen, or click on the button with 3 dots at the bottom of the screen to submit a question at any time during the discussion. Finally, if you experience any difficulties, use the chat tool to send a message to the host, Carrie Dickinson. Hey, with that out of the way, and two other points real quick. I really want to thank the UW Press for agreeing to do this, and obviously Carrie Dickinson, who's organized this. And then finally, Professor Cliff Conrad, who's the faculty director of Wiscape, has provided wonderful leadership for this program as well as Wiscape. So Pat, are you ready for the first question?
I am ready, but first let me thank you, Noel, and Wiscape and the UW Press for having me here today to discuss the book. And I really appreciate your support of the project and having me join you. So thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so here's the first question, Pat. Can you talk about your history within the UW system, a little bit beyond the titles that I tossed out earlier, and what led you to write this book? Why write the book? There hasn't been a book, so that's one reason, but what drove you?
Well, as you point out, I have had a very long history with the UW system and UW-Madison. I got both of my degrees here. And of course, 30 years of working in system administration really has me deeply involved and connected with much of the history of the system itself. So the system was formed when I was an undergraduate, and here we are now, nearly 50 years later. I hate to say that, but anyway, I've long had an interest in the system and cared very much about the success of the system and all of its institutions. I decided to write the book because I really felt there was a need. As you just said, there is no history of the system. There's a lengthy 4-volume history of the University of Wisconsin that goes all the way back to 1848 and concludes in 1971 when the system was formed. And then there are other books about UW-Madison, and a number of UW campuses do have their own histories. But there was nothing about the system. And I felt that was a gap that needed to be filled. When I did retire, I approached Kevin Riley, who was then the president of the system, and he agreed that this was a project that was worth supporting, and he did so. And with his encouragement and support from the system administration, I proceeded to prepare the book.
Wonderful. So I'm going to dig in a little bit here in your writing, research, analysis, and writing. So the question is, before the 1971 merger, there were several efforts to merge the UW and the Wisconsin State University systems. Can you select one failed merger attempt and explain who pushed for that merger? Why did they do that? And why do you think it was a failure?
Well, as you said, there were several attempts, and I think they mainly came up during the 50s and were pursued by the Republican governor at the time. And I think they failed largely because the conditions weren't quite right for a merger. There had been growing concern about the cost of operating all these institutions of higher education, and that is a concern that has been continuous, really. But in the 50s, when these efforts were initiated, it was still very much a go-go time for higher education, and there was a lot of demand for higher education. The GI Bill after World War II and then the coming of age of the baby boomers really created a great deal of demand, and as a result, the timing was just a little bit off. And so other efforts that emerged from these failed attempts involved trying to create some coordinating vehicle, and the Coordinating Council for Higher Education emerged as an organization, a state agency that was meant to sort of control growth and coordinate the activities of the Wisconsin State Universities and the University of Wisconsin, which is basically Madison, Milwaukee at that time. But the conditions just weren't quite right to sort of blend everything together. That all changed quite a lot in the 60s.
Wonderful. Thank you. The third question, there were many colorful individuals in your book who played a critical role building the UW system pre-merger. Can you select one person who may not be well known, but who you believe played an important role?
Well, somebody who is not particularly well known, but whose role really turned out to be critical, is Raymond Johnson, who was the Republican state Senate leader in 1971. And he had been familiar with some of these earlier merger attempts, and he was part of this group of people who were considerably concerned about cost and expense and program duplication. And so when Pat Lucey, as governor, proposed his merger bill, Senator Johnson really wanted to put forward a Republican version of merger. He encouraged Ray Heinzen, another state senator, and who was at the time the chair of the Senate Education Committee. And so Heinzen prepared an alternative bill. And it was that bill that eventually became the basis for the merger bill. So Johnson is not mentioned frequently. He's certainly not as colorful as either Governor Lucey or Governor Dreyfus or some of the other individuals who were more prominent in the effort, but his role was really crucial.
Interesting. The next question is this is kind of an essential question. What were the primary arguments, both supporting and opposing the merger in 1971?
Well, there were a number of arguments and a number of conditions that began to favor a merger. So again, the main argument was the concern with cost and program duplication and lack of coordinated growth in higher education. So by 1971, we had effectively two large higher education systems in the state, the Wisconsin State Universities, and then the University of Wisconsin, which by that point included Madison, UW Milwaukee, UW Green Bay, UW Parkside, and a number of two-year campuses that were connected to those institutions. So it was really a big operation, and there were a lot of questions about why we were doing all this and who was going to sort of really control what was happening. And the Coordinating Council on Higher Education had largely failed to produce that kind of growth. So there was that element. But there was also sort of a growing trend in that period for states to create higher education systems. So there was a lot of interest in doing that. North Carolina was doing it. California had a 3-tier system. So there was kind of a national interest in creating systems that was in the background. And Wisconsin itself had undertaken a large study of education in the state and produced a report that really had suggested creating one huge state education agency that would cover everything from kindergarten through graduate school. So those were things in the background that the policymakers and the politicians would have been aware of. But in addition, it was a time of great civil unrest. The campuses, Madison in particular, but all the other institutions to some degree or another were experiencing a great deal of protest, most of it related to the war, but there was also a strong element of concern with civil rights and growing attention to affirmative action or the need for affirmative action to encourage more diversity on campus. But the protests were considered by many to be getting way out of hand, and there was great concern that the public anger would eventually be terribly damaging to all of higher education. So with all of these things kind of in the mix, and from Lucy's perspective, the possibility of a bipartisan approach to a merger, because it was a Republican idea, it seemed like a reasonable time to put forward a merger proposal.
Interesting. Thank you. The other fifth question, we have a few more questions I can ask before we go to the audience. Your book explored events, conditions, and challenges that have shaped the UW system since merger. Can you highlight a few noteworthy examples that really resonate with you?
Well, I think the biggest ongoing challenge, obviously, has been financial, because it was a concern underlying merger in the first place. So at the very beginning, right after the merger, there was an immediate effort to shrink the UW system, and there was a lot of damaging, ultimately, work done on what campuses might be closed, and it was a very unsettling effort that was right at the very beginning when the system was trying to come together. So it made it difficult to do that. And so that sort of challenge was there in the beginning and has continued in one way or another throughout the history of the system. As time went by, although no 4-year campuses were ever closed, and only one 2-year center was eventually closed. As time went by, there were other competing priorities within the state that made it difficult for the university to maintain a large share of the taxpayer dollars for its own support. So I think money has been an ongoing issue and continues to be an issue. And in the current time that we are in, I think it will have even longer standing difficulties for the university system and for all the institutions. So that's probably the principal ongoing issue. There are some other problems that have been pretty continuous too. We've had a lot of issues with culture war problems that have sort of been driven by the generally increasing political division over time, and that has become even deeper and starker in recent years. So anger about those things and the tendency to create animosity toward higher education based on a variety of issues related to culture wars, from affirmative action to alleged liberal bias in the academy. All of those things have tended to have a negative impact on the image of higher education in the state.
Do you? I know a lot of people, um, for a while, um, almost fell into two camps, where um, they talked about whether it helped to, looking specifically at now what we call UW Madison, University of Wisconsin Madison. Do you believe that the merger on the whole helped to protect and advance UW Madison's quality and reputation?
Well, I think there was a lot of concern about whether Madison's quality and reputation would be damaged by the merger. In fact, that was one of the big arguments against merger, was that there would be some sort of so-called leveling effect that would damage reputation just by being part of a system of other schools that had different kinds of origins and were not major research institutions. And then under that, there was another financial consideration at the time of merger and for some time afterwards. There was concern that somehow Madison's resources would be drained away from Madison for the support of the rest of the system. And there was concern that if that were to occur, quality at Madison would be threatened. But in the end, those things really didn't happen. Some people may be convinced that they did, but really the people who organized the system in the early post-merger years were very, very smart in creating a means of allocating the system's funding that was based on really the missions of the individual institutions, and then recognizing that a research institution would require a greater, higher level of resource support. And having accomplished that sort of allocation process and identifying missions for all the institutions, I think Madison really did get the advantage of being part of a unified budget and mission process. So yes, I think I think Madison came out okay. I would also say that Lucy felt very strongly at the time that Madison needed protection from politics, because many people were very angry at the campus disruptions that were occurring in the late 60s, early 70s, and Madison, being part of a system, gave it a little bit of distance from attacks on its own alleged failure to control what was happening on campus.
Thank you. The seventh question is, are there key moments in the UW system's history that have implications for the future success of the UW system's campuses, as well as, which includes UW Madison? What can we learn from them?
Well, I would say that the whole history of the system, and really of all of its institutions, just demonstrates an incredible amount of resilience and capacity to meet crises. I think when you look back and recognizing we're in a very unusual time now, but when you look back, almost all UW campuses have survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the upheavals of the 70s, and even, if you went back now, there's a sort of eerie similarity now in terms of what's happening academically on the Madison campus and what was going on in 1970, which really was a year in which campus academic life was severely disrupted. Many classes were not held, people didn't attend class, there were strikes, and at the end of the summer that year, Sterling Hall was bombed. So, we as a system have weathered a lot of difficulty, and I think that because of the sort of the bench strength of our team, I think we'll be prepared to get through the current challenges.
Were there any moments in the UW system's history that we could learn from as we respond and adapt to COVID-19 going through right now?
Any specific moments?
Yeah, in the sense of significant transformational or almost existential moments of survival, if you want to look at it that way. For example, you mentioned when there was but one UW college that was closed. That was there were significant questions about the future of colleges or centers. But were there other moments after 1971 that there were significant, I would say, emergencies? It could have been significant fiscal. That's frequently what we look at when there's a significant question or questions that campuses, either UW-Madison or UW-Oshkosh, have to deal with at a really high level.
Well, certainly that early effort to shrink the system back in the 70s was an existential challenge, as was the later 2011 effort to sort of demerge the system and take it apart. And from those moments, I think we can learn at least this, that not only is there institutional resilience and durability, but also there's a great deal of public support. I think, for the university, all of the campuses. Each campus, I think, has in some way its own following. There's a lot of commitment locally, everywhere, to support and protect and maintain what we have in terms of a system. I don't think that really has gone away.
I'll ask one final question, and then I'll turn it to the attendees who have started submitting questions. And please continue to submit your questions because they're better than mine. My last question, actually, it's not my question. It's a question that came from attendee is, Pat, what most surprised you during the research and writing of the book? Was there an aha moment, as Professor Cliff Conrad frequently says?
Well, I would sort of say, in a way, repeat what I just said. I was surprised in listening to a lot of the oral interviews of many of the key figures in the system and the leadership and the politicians, at how much real affection there is for the system. I am an insider, and I was an insider for a long time, and sometimes you get a bit of the bunker mentality, and you start thinking everybody's against us, and they just want to cut our budgets, and life is hard. But really, even from the beginning, I think most of the leadership state leadership was united in trying to advance the system. I mean, unfortunately, some of that has eroded in more recent years, but I think, again, for the public and for the people, the students and the parents who keep coming to UW schools, there remains a really strong well of goodwill and hopefulness about the university system and all the campuses.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, there's two questions, and I strongly encourage others to submit questions. So the first one, Pat, asks you, do you feel like there's less public or political support for the UW system now than in the 1970s? And the person elaborated, I'm thinking about how UW-Stevens Point, the loss of the humanities, as one example that we might have heard of a year or two ago. So if you believe that there's less public or political support for the UW system, the question is, how do we foster more support for the UW system in Wisconsin?
Well, I mean, as I just mentioned, I think there is less support probably than there was at the beginning, mainly because political divisions have become much more difficult to bridge in recent years. To go back to the politics of resentment, the sort of anti-elitism, the concern about the meritocracy and where colleges land in all that, I think has helped erode support in recent years. But again, I also do have a lot of faith in the people who keep believing in the university system enough to keep sending their kids and going themselves and coming back. So I think we need to, sort of take a longer view and hope that one of the things that comes out of the kind of crisis, national existential crisis that we're in now, will be a healing of some of this division and perhaps a moderation of some of the partisanship that has characterized political activity in recent years.
Thank you. Another question is, Pat, considering the objectives behind the merger statute, what is your opinion regarding a governor's authority to appoint members of the Board of Regents at large, as opposed to requiring regional representation on the Board of Regents?
That's an interesting question because that was a big issue at the time of merger. A lot of people felt that there should be regent appointees pretty much based or tied to a specific campus or a region. And that idea was thrashed out in the Merger Implementation Study Committee, which is a body that was created by the merger law to sort of look at a lot of issues and design the merger statute after the legislation was passed. And the thinking at the time was, we shouldn't do that because we want the university system to be above all these kind of local interests. And we want regents who represent the whole state and not some particular constituency. And I'm inclined to think they had that right. My opinion.
Well, your opinion's important. You wrote the book. The next question is, was the creation of the system in Wisconsin inevitable, UW system? Was it inevitable? Person asks, in other words, if the 1971 attempt to create the UW system actually failed, hypothetically, if it would have failed, as the ones as you described, the one that you described, do you believe it would have eventually succeeded?
Probably, just because there wasn't, nobody had a handle on what was going on in what had become sort of a rivalry between the two systems. And the competition for funding was not really being helpful to either side. And I think probably from the politician's point of view, it was probably a good idea to get all this controversy and internal wrangling in one house and under one roof, the Board of Regents, and then there would be less of this end running to the legislature and advocating on behalf of my campus, your campus, do me this favor and that. So I think in a way it would have become inevitable, and then also because of money and because of other priorities that took on greater importance as time went on. So eventually there was going to be a need to do something and make it work better. All of higher ed.
Thank you. There's another question about how did you go about conducting your research for the book?
How did I go about it? Well, parts of it were really pretty fun. I interviewed a lot of people I had known, and many of them I had worked with. So it was fun to kind of reconnect with a lot of old friends, really, and then get their sort of long-term perspectives on the development of the system and important issues and what mattered and so on. And then I also relied very heavily, and this is a wonderful resource for any historian of the campus or of higher ed, but the university has in the Madison UW Archive Management and Records Office, which I probably just messed up their name, but in any event, they have a wonderful store of oral interviews of lots and lots of people, faculty members, some students, politicians, leaders, regents, and so you can listen to those, and it's really fun because it's very lively. Many of the people, especially the colorful ones like Lee Dreyfus, Pat Lucy, but others as well come across very candidly and frankly and freshly in these interviews. So it was very interesting to hear those. And then of course, I just did the usual stuff. I plowed through all the regent meeting minutes and tried to figure out what issues were important at what times, and all that kind of more dusty stuff. There are a lot of archives that you can plow through of people's individual files, and so.
Excuse me. There's another question that asks, can you say a bit more about the culture wars that you referenced in your book and those that still exist today, meaning the culture wars that still exist today? Mm-hmm. And then she concludes, more specifically, what are the threats that the UW system that they're currently facing? So there's a question about culture wars. Do they still exist today? And then what you believe are the imminent threats or the current threats confronting UW system?
Well, as for the culture wars, I personally am a veteran of the culture wars because many of the culture war issues ended up in litigation or legal challenges of one kind or another. So every time there was a big legal case or big legal outcry, there was a sort of nasty reaction of one kind or another that sort of perpetuated some of these negative feelings toward the university. The hate speech rule, which came up in the early 90s, was very controversial and caused a lot of ill will. Subsequently, we had the student fee funding case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And although we won in a very great decision, 9-0, but the fallout from that led to about 5 more years of litigation about paying attorney's fees and some other stuff, and it sort of spawned a whole new set of controversies that were sort of aimed at pushing the limits of the Supreme Court decision. So there was always this kind of back and forth that went on and on. More recently, I think there have been these various speech issues that have really arisen in connection with efforts to punish students for disrupting speech on campus, and many of those ideas that are now reflected in policy in the system were coming straight out of conservative think tanks, and so there was less of this organic feel of developing individual system policy and more this sort of national effort to shape university policy with prescribed or suggested policies that could be adopted on campuses. So that's the culture wars just go on, and I don't really there probably will never be much of a let up in that. But the other question was about threats, current threats. I think right now we're in such a strange time that I would have to say it once again that getting through this pandemic is obviously the biggest single threat, and it will be very difficult because not only is the university losing a lot of money just through closure and refunding dorm fees and all that sort of stuff, no sports seasons and that sort of thing, but but the repercussions of all this on the states will really diminish state revenue. So the university system's already diminishing share of state money will be even smaller, and it will take a good long time to bounce back.
Here's an interesting question, more like contemporary, if you want to look at it that way, from a colleague of yours, who I'll keep unnamed.
I'm sorry. No, I'm losing you a little bit.
Oh, I apologize. The question is, what was the most surprising thing you discovered about the 2011 effort to break up the UW system? And I think that was more specifically related to a former chancellor and Governor Walker, who were looking at potentially pulling the UW-Madison out of the UW system. So the question is, what was the most surprising thing you discovered about that as you were conducting your research and observing that situation?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, the whole thing was surprising, I guess. But I think that the most shocking thing, in a way, was the extent to which the former chancellor declined to consult with either the president of the system or the regions. That is the first time, I think, that I'm aware that anything like that happened. I mean, there was, I wouldn't say that everybody was always completely open and forthright about what the planning was, but that was really sort of an amazing, thing that I discovered as I delved into the background.
Thank you. And the next question is, what was unique about Wisconsin that facilitated the environment for the merger to occur? And then the person asks, why didn't neighboring states such as Minnesota or Michigan have similar mergers? So what was the environment that helped facilitate the merger, and why do you think our neighbors didn't follow suit in some form or fashion?
Well, the Michigan and Minnesota both have constitutional universities. UW system or universities are not set up as independent, almost standalone branches of government. So they had a different situation and sort of a different history and size configuration. So we're probably more like North Carolina. And then, other states as well, smaller systems, were at the time of merger doing more or less similar thinking in terms of bringing all their state institutions under one roof. And as I mentioned earlier, there was always California out there as the model of how you organize higher education. And that model, of course, doesn't really fit us very well because we're so much smaller. But Clark Kerr had a very distinct idea of how the University of California's higher ed structure ought to be set up. And that structure has pretty well endured all this time. And so it became a model for other people trying to think in a broader way about what higher education should be. I think a difficulty was that there wasn't always a very good fit within the UW system between a major research institution, a major urban institution, and a number of quite a bit smaller regional institutions that had different roots and origins in teacher ed and technical education and that sort of thing. And sometimes it became difficult to impose a structure that would work fairly well at Madison on, say, UW La Crosse or a smaller school that just didn't have all those layers of governance and faculty involvement.
Another question is an interesting question. What impact do you think that the book will have on the system in the pandemic and the post-pandemic era? So now you're looking ahead.
Well, I don't know. I hope somebody pays some attention to it and, uses it as a basis for for better understanding where we've been and where we need to go. I mean, that's kind of the all purpose of all history, right? You try to figure out where to go from where you've been. And I think it's an interesting story. And I think, our institutions have never been more important. And I don't mean just higher ed institutions, but government and higher ed and, state agencies and so on. Because in a time of crisis like this is where you go for your solutions. And so I would hope that, people would understand the importance of continuing to support higher ed. After all, the economic answers, the medical and scientific answers are going to come out of higher education institutions, and many of them will be coming from our system. So, I hope people take that lesson and move it forward.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you think the advent of educational technology has and will affect systemness? So again, how do you think the advent of educational technology has and will affect systemness, interrelationships between the campuses within the UW system?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it can make relationships much more effective. We can be in much better contact with each other through technological innovations like this wonderful WebEx meeting we're having, and so it should make sharing knowledge around the system broadly, easier, more transparent, more available, more accessible. So I think in a way should be very helpful. It should be helpful for students, but it will also be helpful for various bureaucratic activities, meetings, and so on. On the other hand, though, and I'm probably a bit of a Luddite here, but I think it's hard to replace face-to-face contact and for a lot of purposes.
The next question is about the Wisconsin idea. So the person asks, in what way or to what extent was the Wisconsin idea legacy told and retold after the merger? Do you think it was changed in some way after merger? So again, the question is, in what way or to what extent was the Wisconsin idea legacy told and retold after the merger?
Well, I think it was told in pretty much the same way, and the way it was told is the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. And that particular tagline was not by Charles Van Heist. That was developed in the UW-Madison PR department, I think, sometime in the 30s or 40s. But that is a good way. It's a good summary. And I think people really continue to reiterate that. I think that for an institution like what was the UW Extension, when it was a separate standalone UW institution, they were the front-facing line of the Wisconsin idea. So I think they were really out there emphasizing in every county of the state that was what the university was all about. But I think although the idea originated at the Madison campus, the other institutions really bought into it and felt much the same way, because on the smaller local level, they were trying to do the same thing: research, teaching, service to the community.
Okay. The next question is, you mentioned Governor Lucey and lawmakers at some time establishing criteria for campus closures in the past. While not pursued or implemented, except for the one college I always forget, Medford or Merrill, do you recall what were some of the metrics or factors that the governor and legislators considered? I don't know if the person is thinking ahead by asking the question, or yeah.
The politicians didn't really provide metrics themselves. They demanded that the university develop a plan, and the university did. So this was way back in the beginning in the Weaver administration. But, there were no specified metrics coming from the political people. I think at the time it was just a more practical consideration of how, what the individual financial well-being of each campus was. The two-year center that was closed was Medford, and by the time it closed, it had become so small that there was really, it was really impractical to keep it going. I can't remember how many students they had, but it was, getting down to 25 or 30 students, and it just, really didn't make any sense. On the other hand, in the wake of all this effort to shrink the system, Tommy Thompson and Tom Loftus, who was the assembly speaker at the time, pursued a statewide sort of traveling roadshow, and they went to all the campuses and decided we needed all of them. So that probably isn't terribly helpful, but that was the feeling at the time.
Another question is, since the merger occurred, what do you believe, which goals do you believe have not been met? So again, since the merger occurred, there were obviously some stated and unstated goals of the merger. What goals do you believe were not met?
Well, I do believe that there was an element of cost control and better coordination goal that was met. Now, there might have been a little wavering on some of that periodically, but that was a main goal. I think Madison was protected from the upheavals of the Vietnam War and civil rights unrest. So I think for the most part, those kinds of goals were met.
Looking at it, questions are rolling in quickly. I can't keep up with everything, but there's one. The reorganization of the UW extension, the most recent restructuring where extension was moved back to UW-Madison, the UW colleges became branch campuses of several of the universities, and Wisconsin Public Radio and Public Television was brought back into UW-Madison. So the person asked, the reorganization of UW Extension and the UW colleges dramatically changed the voice of the two-year colleges and extension. And the person asks you, what do you believe, where does that leave the Wisconsin idea?
Well, I think the extension has always, as I said, been sort of the front line of presenting the Wisconsin idea on a very local, granular level. But the creation of extension as an independent institution was a little unusual at the time of merger too. So I think because it had been part of Madison, and now that it is again more in that mode, it is sort of a return to what had been. So I don't know. I think it's probably too early to tell, but I would assume that the same commitment to the Wisconsin idea that has always been part of extension will continue. I've known and worked with a lot of extension people over the years, and they are some of the most idealistic proponents of the good work that the university does that there are. So I don't think that kind of commitment will change.
A person submitted two questions, so I get the honor of the pleasure of selecting one of the two that I'll say he or she. Okay, he did. He wants to know, Pat, are there Tommy Thompsons or Tom Loftuses like political leaders today? And number two, related to that. Oh, and remember, this is being recorded. And then related to that, who in the legislature is a champion of the UW system today, do you believe? So again, who are the Tommy Thompson like and the Tom Loftus like political leaders today? And then number two is, who in the legislature is related to that? Who in the legislature is a champion of the UW system?
Well, I would say, sadly, that there aren't many Tommy Thompsons and Tom Loftuses around because, again, as we've been saying throughout this conversation, the political divide has just gotten wider and more painful in the last few years. So I know that Tommy Thompson has recently, sort of been publicly ruing the fact that there's no way to bring people together. It doesn't seem to be, which is a very depressing thought. And, so that leads to the question, who are the powerful leaders and champions of the UW system in the legislature? And it appears that there's not a great deal of strength and leadership there at this time. I'm sure there are people who have a lot of goodwill and want to do what they can to support the system, but I don't think that there's a big dominating figure who would have like the kind of position of a Tom Loftus, who was Speaker of the Assembly, or Tommy, who had long legislative experience before he became governor. So, we're missing some strong leadership there.
All right. Before I ask the last question, I just want to inform everyone that you can purchase the book, A History of the University of Wisconsin System, at a discount, a 40% discount, using the code that you can see on the slide, I hope, AA203. And that 40% discount is available through May 21st. Of this year. So you have a little less than 1 month, as I do, to get the book. We'll go with this last question, unless we finish it. No, we'll just go with this last question. Pat, the person asks, I'll rephrase it to be a little more, anyway, what's your opinion of the current UW system presidential search? And the question the person asks is, what is your feeling with this particular UW system presidential search that does not include faculty or academic staff on the search committee? Do you have any feelings about that?
Well, again, I do believe that it's important to have a faculty voice. A leader of the system has to lead not only all the institutions, but a leader has to be a credible spokesperson for higher education issues with the people on the front lines in the faculty and staff. So I think getting that voice is very important.
Okay.
I wouldn't. I would not recommend this kind of search because I think that sort of participation has always been very important and was from the very beginning.
Okay. Well, we have 4 more minutes left, so I'm going to toss one more question out, at least. We'll see. It's an interesting question. And they're asking now, Pat, just to set the stage, asking about the when they did the conversion of the UW hospital to a quasi-public-private authority in the mid-'90s. So the person asks, what have been the pros and cons and perhaps lessons learned during that conversion of the UW hospital into a legal authority? As many of you know, the argument for that was so that UW hospital clinics could compete against the private healthcare system. So the person concludes, Pat, by asking the question, has the independence of the UW Hospital Clinic Authority altered how you believe the UW-Madison Medical School and Public Health interacts with government? So you can take different elements of that if you'd like to answer it, because it's quite rich and complex. Perhaps you could talk about what are the pros and cons and lessons learned since the mid-'90s. Maybe, whatever you feel comfortable asking, because it's a rich question.
Well, I would say that at the time, that so-called sort of spin-off of the hospital was meant to allow greater freedom from state regulation so that there was the ability to compete with other health organizations. Because there's always the issue that, you have to maintain the financing, adequate financing for the medical mission so that you can support the medical school and train doctors and then have a hospital. And so that financial need drove the spinoff because there were restrictions on what a state agency, which when the hospital was part of Madison campus, drove the need for greater independence. And so they got independence, and with that there came some other requirements. An organization like that had to be able to support bonding authority, had to meet certain other financial requirements to keep going. But that was essential to keep the hospital going. In more recent times, I think that the relationship with the med school became somewhat more complicated and difficult because with a hospital with a staff and a group of administrators on one hand working for the hospital, and then the medical school with a research and service function and teaching, there was sometimes some difficulty because the hospital had a hierarchy, the medical school had its hierarchy, the individual faculty members were sort of hierarchically assigned, and there were some difficulties with making that mesh smoothly. I do believe, and I say this because I was part of it because I was also on the UW Medical Foundation board recently, and I think when we created the merger that led to the UW Health system, a lot of that conflict between and among administrators has been ameliorated. So I think there have been some improvements there, but time will tell.
Okay. Well, with that, we're at 1 o'clock exactly. So Pat, thank you very much for the presentation, and for everyone who participated, and also for those of you who asked questions. Thank you very much. Have a safe, healthy, and happy day. And again, Pat, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.